All right, there we go. All right, so let's pick up where we left off in chapter 12. We were talking about Sternberg's triarchic theory of love. So we've already defined passion, intimacy, and commitment, but let's redefine those just really quickly. So intimacy we've mentioned quite a few times, like leading up to this lecture, that intimacy is the type of love here would be liking or intimacy alone. You're sharing things with someone, sharing your thoughts, your hopes, your dreams. They're sharing those things with you. That's the kind of intimacy we were talking about there. Passion, that's sexual attraction, that kind of, and if you have just passion, you would call that, in this theory, infatuation, that you just sexually desire someone. And then commitment can be on its own a type of love as well. And so on its own, it's called empty love because you don't have this intimacy, you're not sharing with someone, or you don't have that passion or sexual attraction to them. You're committed to them and committed to that relationship, but there might not be this back and forth with sharing things with that person or any intimacy. So you might imagine some situations where that might be a really good form of love. For example, if you're caring for someone who is not able to communicate with you for some reason, maybe in a care home, for example, you might not really be able to have any intimacy with them, share with them, and have them share it with you if they've, say, had a really severe stroke or something like that. But you might still be very committed to this person. So even though it's called empty love, it's not necessarily a negative thing. So there would be some situations where you might have just commitment as a big portion of that love. So let's say a grandparent or something like that who you're caring for, who you can no longer be intimate with. You might have been intimate, like shared things with them there, and they shared things with you in the past. So you still might have that companionate love. So we talked about those three key pieces: the intimacy, the passion, and the commitment. Now let's put those together for these other kinds of love. So consummate love is considered the strongest or fullest form of love. It's combining all those three components: that passion, that intimacy, and that commitment all together. So you'll see that here in the middle of the chart. So this is a kind of love that you'd be aiming for with like a long-term partner or a marriage partner or something like that, where you would have that intimacy and sharing with that person, that sexual interest, as well as this commitment to that person. So if you are, say, going to a marriage and family therapist and working on your relationship, one of the things they could do, that they might do, is use a tool like this, have this theory in the back of their mind, and figure out, well, which aspect of love is missing in this relationship. Is there a lack of passion between these people? Is there a lack of intimacy between these people? Is there a lack of commitment between these people? And then work on whatever dimensions are missing. Because if someone's still very intimate with their partner, but there's less passion or commitment, they might think in their mind that this person's somewhere here where like my mouse pointer is, and try to bring them to here. Or if there's a lack of passion, they might try to work on that to bring them more to the middle here. So it's a useful visual model as well to kind of imagine where you fall with love for a given person. So I think I mentioned last time rom-coms are good examples of starting with passion or starting with intimacy and building to romantic love. So romantic love, I think that's the next one that I have here. Do I not have that one there? I guess I don't. All right, let's just talk about it with this. So romantic love is intimacy, so that sharing of yourself with someone, and that passion, that sexual desire for that person. So oftentimes in a romantic comedy, we might see two people start with passion and then learn to build that intimacy over time. Or maybe they start with intimacy and learn to build that passion. So maybe they're really close friends. They might even have companionate love. They have a commitment to each other. They're seeing each other all the time. They're really intimate. They're best friends. And then over time, one of them develops passion for the other one. And then the whole conflict is the other one. Are they going to develop that passion or not? So hopefully you can think of some examples in like media or even maybe in your own lives of how these components of this theory of love might work together. So romantic love is that passion and intimacy together. Another thing you might see in rom-coms is at the end, maybe they're making a commitment. So maybe they have that romantic love, but the whole conflict is around, well, how do we get to this consummate love? How do we add that commitment to this? And so that's sometimes the end, like the conclusion of the movie. They're together now, or they're married now, or something like that. So companionate love is a pretty common love that you might have with a lot of different people in life. So here we have intimacy and commitment together. So commitment is that wanting and desire and assurance that you're going to be there for that person's going to be there for you, and intimacy, that sharing of yourself. So putting those together is something you might have with, say, your best friend or best friends. You might have that with siblings. You might have that with parents. So this companionate love might be something that you could have with a lot of different people. So even though we're saying consummate love is the best in this theory, or considered to be the strongest form of love, that's not to say that any other forms of love are necessarily like second tier. So like we mentioned last time, intimacy with friends, having a strong best friend, or those kinds of relationships, especially in early adulthood, can be really beneficial to a person. So this companionate love is really, really important as well. So you might think in maybe a relationship that you have with a sibling or a best friend, if things are rocky or something like that, think about it. Are you being as intimate as you have been in the past? Maybe there's something that's keeping you from being as intimate as you had been previously. Are you not as committed to that person anymore? Or are they not as committed to you? Is that something you can work on? So similar to how a marriage and family therapist would think, well, how are these dimensions working in this relationship? You can think, well, this is the kind of love I have or I want with my best friend. Which of these pieces do I need to build or work on, or do we need to work on? So it's a useful model for that. So hopefully you can take this idea in the future and build even better relationships. That's one of my main points of going into it in this much detail. And then this one here, we haven't really talked about it much yet. It's passion plus commitment together. So you have that sexual attraction to someone and you're committed to them, or you're making a commitment to them, but you don't really know them very well. So you might see this, for example, in people that meet and get married really quickly. So they might have a strong sexual desire for each other. They might make this big commitment of something like a marriage, but if they've only known each other a couple weeks or something like that, there might not have been time to develop that intimacy portion of this. So that's what we would call fatuous love. So this one is maybe not as common overall in things that you would see just in day-to-day life. But yeah, any questions with this triangle or triarchic theory of love and these components, or where something might fit? All right. Well, I think I just talked about all these things. So this companionate love is also, for some researchers, they also refer to it as affectionate love. So just depends on who you are reading. All right, so this little review is essentially goes over the exact same things we've just talked about, but there are some different examples than I used in class. So if you still want more examples, if you think that would be useful for you, definitely give this a watch before the exam. But most of it is review over the exact same things we just talked about, just with new examples, if that would be helpful to you. So I won't go over that right now. All right, so there are some cross-cultural variations in relationships that we see. So collectivist countries tend to have intimacy more spread out between more people in the community. So versus individualistic countries like the US, or most of the US, or most people in the US. So this culture, intimacy is for smaller groups. So maybe immediate family, maybe a couple close friends, versus that kind of intimacy and sharing about yourself would be a little wider in many other countries and cultures. So also individualistic countries like the US, for example, place a greater emphasis on passion and a greater emphasis on self-disclosure in relationships with, say, an immediate, a main partner. So some of these are referring to like the intimacy being spread out between more people, and there's a higher desire for more passion or more self-disclosure for a single partner in the US. So let's talk about different lifestyles in early adulthood. So one of these is to be single. So like I mentioned, most of chapter 12 focuses on like marriage relationships and things like that. So definitely useful things to study, and it's good that we know so much about it. People are interested in in these kinds of things, in relationships, but it does really skip over the like maintaining friendships in early adulthood too. So that extra credit assignment of reading that paper or watching that video and then writing a short paper on that, that would be really good to do to get a little more information about maintaining friendships and why that's so important in early adulthood. So about 45% of adults 18 and over were single in studies in 2016. So this includes not cohabitating and not being married. So the rest of those numbers so anyone who was cohabitating or married was defined as not single. So it can be challenging to be single in early adulthood. So society is very marriage oriented, and so it might make it more lonely. There might be more challenges forming intimate relationships. That could also be a bidirectional like spiral. If you have challenges forming those kind of intimate relationships and then you're not having those intimate relationships, it can be harder to build those skills to do that and that kind of thing. So that can be a kind of self-perpetuating cycle as well. So with this, there are benefits to being single as well. Here, oh goodness, why did this happen again? I forgot these characters' names from How I Met Your Mother. Barney, that's his name. Okay, so benefits of a single life. I mean, most of the show, that was Barney. Spoilers, sorry. More time to make decisions about your life, more autonomous decision making, more time to pursue your own interests, more time for travel, more privacy. These are things that people who are single talk about as benefits of being single. So with this, what about the dating landscape? How is that working right now? Well, this data is probably now 4 years old, so I do wonder if it's changed to this point. But as of about like 6 or 4 years ago, 40% of single adults, early adults, were dating someone they met online. Only about 24% of people were dating someone that they met through a friend. About 48% have sex before their actual first date, like first official date, or what they would term as a first date. So with that, the researchers' conclusions here were that millennials seem to want to know as much as possible about a person and about who they are and things like that before committing to any serious relationship. So that includes even actually going on real dates or what they would consider a date. Yeah, so a lot of this was survey data, and the individuals, the single adults themselves, were defining what counts as a date. So some of the things that they wouldn't necessarily have counted as a date, I would have counted as a date, but I mean, I'm not the researcher in this kind of case. And it's good to let people define things themselves as well in these kind of studies, because then you can learn a lot about that as well. All right, so this kind of thing, Ted Mosby's proclaiming his love to Robin, I think that's in like episode 1 or 2, so hopefully not spoilers, is not very common. That doesn't happen very often. So with this, cohabitation is getting more common, or has in the more recent decades. So that's living together in a sexual relationship with no marriage. So this comic talks about, well, I'll let you read it really quick. It's kind of funny and relevant. All right. So in previous decades, cohabitation was considered like a step towards marriage or like an alternative path towards marriage. But in more recent decades, with the rates rising, it's actually a lifestyle in and of itself. So it's not generally, on average, again. So this is looking at a normal distribution of people who are cohabitating and then enter into a marriage. On average, that's not what most people are doing. They're cohabitating and not getting married on average. So it's its own separate lifestyle versus in previous decades, it tended to be like a cohabit to see how things work and then jump into a marriage or not. So, but with this, cohabitation relationships, on average, again, tend to only last 5 years. So this is, again, a bell curve. There's people who've been together 40 years cohabitating, and there's people who are together probably even just what is going on? Am I on the right network? Yeah, that's the one that should work the best. All right, it just showed that
It's
offline.
working.
It is working?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, sorry about that. So with this cohabitation, there are mixed results about cohabitating and then marrying being positive or negative. So basically what the results show is there's no net positive or net negative for cohabiting before marriage or not. So there's a lot of other variables that are more important than the cohabiting before marriage to lead to a positive marriage afterwards. So it's not that it's a overall positive or overall negative. Not a really useful predictive variable, basically. So with this, marriage rates in the U.S. have declined in recent years. So only about 20% of U.S. adults are never married. So that was in 2014. I would like to see some updated data, but textbooks take a while to get updated, honestly, considering how often they put out new versions. It's really annoying how few of the stats are actually updated. So in 2016, the U.S. average for the first marriage climbed to 29.5 for men and 27.4 for women. So that was the average age that they were getting married. So almost 30 for men and 27 for women for the first time they were getting married. So this isn't too much higher than previous decades and even centuries, but like overall, that means that this normal distribution has shifted up. So in the past, it was closer, even like 200 years ago, this was closer to about 22 and a half or 23. And so it's moved in those decades and centuries up just a couple of years on average. So that means the youngest people getting married are younger than that, and the oldest people getting married for the first time are even older than that now as well. Or so in a couple centuries ago, so I'm saying youngest is on this side, so that youngest age has also moved up a little bit, and the oldest age has also moved up a little bit too. So that normal distribution has kind of just shifted over the centuries, and this is where it is pretty recently. So marriage in adolescence, so before the ages of like 20, 21, 22, 23, these are more likely to end in divorce. So the average duration of a marriage in the U.S. is 9 years. So if you look at that compared to cohabiting relationships, so 4 years difference, that's fairly significant. But yeah, a lot of marriages. So if we're looking at that normal distribution, the average age of that marriage is 9 years. So there are obviously a lot that end later than that or earlier than that, versus cohabiting has that normal distribution at 5 years. So there are cohabiting relationships that last longer than a lot of marriages. There's marriages that last shorter than a lot of cohabiting relationships. So if you imagine these two overlapping normal distributions, you can get a sense of maybe how people are living their lives, essentially. So emerging adults do still tend to be fairly optimistic about marriage, and have it as a goal oftentimes to create a stable marriage. So again, this is on average. This might not be your experience or maybe even the experience of a lot of people you know. This is just on average again. So married people do have some benefits. They tend to live longer. They tend to have healthier lives, so like more health behaviors, so exercising, eating well, things like that. Feel less physical and emotional stress, so they have better cardiovascular health. Again, these are correlations. So it would be really, really difficult to run an experiment for this to say, okay, you 500 people, you get married, you 500 people, you stay single, you 500 people, you cohabit, and we're going to follow you longitudinally for 30 years and see what the health outcomes are. You can't do that kind of experiment. You can't control all those variables. So all of this is correlational, which means that is it the marriage causing these things, or is it multiple aspects causing both the marriage and these health behaviors, or are these marriages leading to other behaviors that then lead to health behaviors? There's a lot of different ideas on what the directionality of this causal or the direction of cause is happening here. So what we do know for sure is that they are correlated. So it is predictive. So protective factors for other problems in adulthood happen in marriage. So having that close partner that's there to rely on is a protective factor when other stresses happen, losing a job, things like that. So this goes into resilience. One of the things that adds to resilience is those strong relationships you might have. And so being in a marriage tends to give you that support system right there, makes you a little more resilient to things like that. So many divorces happen between 5 and 10 years into a marriage. You can see that jump right here, which I do think is interesting, considering the cohabiting stat of about 5 years on average. So it does make me wonder about the similarities of why people end cohabiting relationships versus these marriage at around 5 years to 10 years. Is it just because you're legally bound to someone? There might be more assets and things that are shared between you that it makes it harder to end these kinds of relationships and marriage versus cohabiting. I do wonder about that, and I'm sure there's a lot of research on that too. Just this isn't my specific area of research, so if anyone wanted to do a question paper on it, I would definitely be interested to read that and go and read your sources as well. Oh, too far. So after divorce, people tend to have higher rates of depression, anxiety, physical illness, suicide, and motor vehicle accidents. So again, these are correlational relationships. Again, you can't run an experiment where you take 1,000 married people and say, okay, now for science, half of you get divorced, half of you do not, right? That's not going to happen in an experimental kind of study. So the best we can do is follow people longitudinally, then you can get some causal data, and also looking at these correlations might suggest relationships that exist. So just to point out again, correlation doesn't mean causation. And give the funny example of an experiment where you would make people get divorced. You probably have to pay them a lot to do that for all the paperwork to get divorced. So many reasons are cited for getting divorced. So these are some of the most common across the US in many different studies. So growing apart, arguments, lack of respect, adultery, being married too young, domestic violence, different religious affiliations, and having divorced parents are all cited and correlated to divorce. All right, so with this, it can be difficult to trust someone else in a romantic relationship, but there are things to do to like bounce back, to be more resilient in this kind of situation. And I think a lot of these also are relevant for even just breakups. So this is basically a box from your textbook that I think has some really good suggestions. So one of these, use your strengths and resources to cope with difficulties. That's a really good aspect of resilience just in general. Use the strengths that you have, rely on those as resources to cope with whatever kind of difficulties you're faced with. In this specific example, it's a divorce, the end of a relationship. This could go with any kind of relationship, cohabiting relationship as well. So focus on the future rather than the past. Think about what's most important to you going forward. Set challenging goals and plan to reach them. So again, this is something we find from resilience research, that even if it's something like a natural disaster or the death of a family member or the death of a close friend or something like that, setting goals and thinking about the future can really help people bounce back from those kinds of challenges. So also making decisions carefully. Think about especially in a relationship and divorce kind of setting, your decisions about work, lovers, and children are going to have long-lasting impacts. So if there's children involved within this relationship, the new partners that you bring in or potential partners you bring in have an impact on them, could in the future as well. So, but another big one specifically for relationships is thinking of the breaking up of this relationship as a chance to grow personally and to develop more positive relationships in the future as well. So these last two, I think, are really relevant for a lot of challenges that we face in life. So I'm glad that they're here in the book. And the two up here are very much more focused on like relationships specifically and bouncing back from that. All right, so a lot of things that we've talked about, we separate gay and lesbian adults and talk about their trajectory, because oftentimes that's how the studies are. You get your funding and you want to study a specific question. So, but what we're finding is, in a lot of ways, LGBTQ plus relationships are really similar in satisfaction and conflict and all sorts of things to heterosexual relationships. There's not as many differences as maybe people would generally assume. So masculine and feminine roles are relatively uncommon, and that's different from heterosexual relationships. Still, even today, there often is a masculine and feminine role in heterosexual relationships. Only a small segment of the gay male population has a large number of sexual partners. So even though I think that's less of a stereotype now than it was in the past, even 10 years ago or so, probably because people are realizing from knowing people, knowing the stats, things like that, that this isn't really the case. And then an even smaller segment of the lesbian population has a large number of sexual partners as well. So generally, people who are gay and lesbian also prefer long-term committed relationships. Also, this reminds me, I didn't mention people who are asexual or who don't have a sexual interest in people, like don't feel, well, let's go to the love triangle again over here. So essentially, people who are asexual as well fit into this love triangle, this triarchic theory of love, really easily. And so it's another good use of it. Essentially, someone who's asexual wouldn't have that passion or that sexual interest in other people. So they wouldn't necessarily be looking for a romantic love, but that intimacy is still something that most people who are asexual are interested in, and that commitment is still something that people who are asexual are interested in. So focusing on something like companionate love for a person who's asexual is probably something they're a lot more likely than wanting to enter into romantic love if they don't have any interest or desire for passion. So, and again, this goes back to, that's not to say that companionate love is any less or any better than consummate love. They're just different kinds of love that are taking different components, adding intimacy and commitment instead of intimacy, commitment, and passion. So sorry, a little bit tangential. I usually talk about that when we're talking about the triangle theory of love. And I forgot today. Oh, is that really all I have on that? I thought there were more slides. The big key point, though, is that there's not a lot of differences, generalizable differences across LGBTQ plus population in regards to early adult relationships. So Gottman's research is talked about in your book. It's pretty digestible, easy to understand for lay people. I think that's why it is so popular. It's not some of the most cutting edge research that necessarily a therapist, a marriage and family therapist would use with you when you come into their office, but it is still useful and pretty easy to understand for people. So it is good that the book talks about it in this detail. But I do wonder if it might lead students thinking that Gottman is like the best researcher in this area, and not to say Gottman's the worst researcher in this area, but just that they're one of many researchers in the area. But I think it's maybe a little more easy to understand for general people. So that's oftentimes why it's so emphasized in like intro psych classes or this overall lifespan development class where we can't get into a bunch of different theorists. So we just don't have time for it. All right, so with that being said, love maps are something you might have heard about. So with this is basically understanding what a person needs to feel loved and doing things to make that person feel loved. So figuring out how a person themselves also figuring out what they need to feel loved and then sharing that with a partner. That's intimacy right there, sharing that with someone and then trying to do that for each other is the main point of that. So another big key of Gottman's research is nurturing that fondness and admiration. Fondness and admiration. Sorry. So praising each other. Oftentimes people with successful relationships see a lot of their history as positive, even if they had challenges. Together. Oh no, it looks like my internet might have actually died there for a second, but hopefully I'm still here. So generally, even if there's challenges, they've worked through those, they look back on them as positive. And there's things that they admire about each other. So these are aspects that are really common across successful relationships. So another big thing to make relationships, not just marriages, because this applies to other relationships as well. I'm offline again. So. I wonder, so let me know if I'm cutting out for a long period of time. I keep getting like messages that my internet is disconnected multiple times. So let me know if it's long segments of time or short segments of time that I'm being disconnected. Because if it is long, then it might just be better for me to go and like reset my router and log back in. But if it's really short, then probably wait to do that.
Yes, it has been short.
Okay, perfect. So after class, I'll reset my router before my next class. So sorry about that. That's a frustrating thing about technology. Sometimes it just doesn't work very well. So, yeah, seeking support from a partner, turning towards each other, especially when there is a challenge rather than away. So if there's a problem, if there's a fight, obviously, like take a breath, calm down kind of thing. You might need to say go to separate rooms, but working together to get through that challenge. So appreciating a partner's view, even if they disagree. Again, this would take communication, talking about those things, sharing things about them, each other. And this is also this is also commitment too. So if you have that goal to be together and stay together, these are things that you'll do to make a relationship work. Letting your partner influence you as well. So being with someone a lot of the time will lead to you both changing together, or should lead to both of you changing together. So sharing power, not trying to be authoritarian over anyone, or if someone is being authoritarian over you, calling that out, making that be something to change about a relationship. So respecting the partner's point of view, but again, that domineering or authoritarianness, that's not healthy in a relationship. It should be more egalitarian, working together through things, not one person dictating or domineering in a relationship. So with this, creating shared meaning is a really useful thing as well. So humans are really good at creating meaning or finding things that are meaningful to them. So share those with each other in your relationships. Share those, do them together. If there's something really meaningful to a partner and it's not really of an interest to you, maybe it will be over time. Seeing how happy they are or how excited or how involved they are with that thing that's meaningful to them, it might be infectious, for example. So share goals with your partner, help them work towards their goals. Hopefully they're helping you work towards your goals. And that can be something that you can look back at as a really meaningful experience. So, I mean, just one simple example of that in my relationship is working through grad school, both of us working through grad school and sharing those goals and helping each other work together for those things. So just as one example. So the last thing that we'll talk about in chapter 12 is becoming a parent. So the age of first parents is actually starting to the average age. So again, normal distribution, some people have children really early on. Some people have it even later than this. But the average age is getting close to leaving the early adulthood time on average, for most parents. So most parenting practices, though, are passed down or learned from parents. So you might see how this might make sense. You've learned by observation from what your parents did. So that means you might discard or change some parenting practices, but on average, most people just have a little evolution of their parents' parenting practices versus a dramatic shift. This is one thing that, as a fairly new parent, my oldest child is 8, I'm still coming to terms with. I see a lot of my first reactions, even though I teach courses on parenting, I teach courses on early childhood, adolescent development, things like that. Some of my first default behaviors are things that I saw my parents do because you've kind of learned it by observation over time. So this is one reason most people just kind of have a shift in how their parents parented them. Obviously, it is possible to completely dramatically shift how you parent as compared to what you were parented as, but it takes effort. Essentially, you've learned from the way you were parented. It will take effort to parent in a very dramatically different way. So, or more effort than just kind of running on autopilot. So partners may have different parenting styles. So if we think back to our chapter on parenting styles, think of authoritarian versus authoritative. I think in this class, we even heard about a couple different sets of parents who one was authoritarian or permissive, and then the other was a different parenting style, and how that did cause some conflict between those parents, how there were things that they would rely on from one parent than another. So hopefully you remember back to those discussions. So there are a couple different myths about parenting that I definitely wanted to put out there for anyone who, one, is now a parent, two, might be a parent in the future, or might be involved with anyone who might possibly be a parent in the future. So one idea is that the birth of a child will save a failing marriage, and that's very false. That doesn't happen. It can be a source of shared meaning between them. They can start working together on that, but if they don't work on the other things that are leading to conflict and challenge in the marriage, if they're not working on those things specifically, the birth of a child will probably add a lot more stress to the mix rather than fix those things. So another thing is that people often believe that their child will think, feel, and behave like their parents did in their childhoods. So looking at my behavior in childhood and learning about my wife's behavior in childhood, looking at our children, they behave very, very differently than both of us. Some aspects are like, oh yeah, that's exactly how I was when I was that age. But a lot of things, it's just completely not. So it's a big myth that children will be very similar to their parents in childhoods. So it's hard to predict, say, behavior or things like that, interests, hobbies. So having a child gives the parents a second chance at achievement. So parents will often feel, maybe not often, some parents will feel this way, that their child is another chance to achieve something with their life, to do something that they didn't do in the past, give that child the opportunity to do something that they themselves had wanted to do. I remember a time when I was 13 or so. I was living in a fairly rural town. It was actually here in Utah, actually. At that point, it was more rural than it is now. It was Camas, Utah. I don't know if anyone has been there or knows that place. Um, Bigger now after the Olympics, but when I lived there, it was before that. Um, and so I went to a rodeo. That's the main point. I went to a rodeo there, and there was like if you were, I forget what ages, like 8 or older, you could ride a calf. And so there was a father there who was getting very, very agitated that his child was scared to ride on the baby cow. And there was a fight that broke out between the man and his wife, where the wife was yelling at him to um, not force his dreams on the child. So every time I read this, that's the specific example I think of. The wife yelling to not put this man's dreams on the child, because they definitely did not want to ride that baby cow right then. Um, and I think that they ended up not. The child didn't ride the cow, but the man was definitely not happy about that for sure. So don't think of a child as a second chance at doing things that you yourself wanted to do. The child will have their own interests. You should support them in that. Hopefully you remember things from talking about parenting in early childhood that apply here. So another myth is that parenting is an instinct and requires no training. That's not true at all. You might default on the kind of parenting behaviors that you were parented with, but it's definitely not an instinct. You're not going to know necessarily exactly what your baby wants from you or how to deal with certain situations. So there are ways to get training and get help. So one example that works really well is actually having early on, when a baby first comes home, having nurses coming into the home, training on specific things, showing how to swaddle a baby or feed a baby, even sometimes helping out with household things to make the house run a little smoother and getting a family a little more acclimated to setting a sleep schedule and understanding what the baby's needing at different times of the day and their wake cycle, those kinds of things. But as well, even for an adolescent, taking parenting classes, taking a development class, learning about adolescent development can help. Going to a therapist with your family and asking about things you can do to support and help those children. So getting specific training for parenting is really useful. It's not something people just know how to do. If people feel like they just know how to do it, something's definitely going to come up and they won't feel like in that situation they have an instinct of what to do, for sure. So with this, I mentioned this trend, that the first time parent trend of the average age is getting to almost to the point where it's moving out of early adulthood. So the average age for a first time mother is 27 years old. The average age, so more women in the US have been giving birth in their 30s rather than in their 20s. So there we're starting to get out of the early adulthood. Depending on the researcher you ask, it's either 30 or like 35 for early adulthood. Since I'm edging up onto 35, I like the 35 number. So by giving birth to fewer children and reducing the demands of childcare, women have a bigger portion of their lives for their own endeavors. As we talked about with dual earning families, oftentimes that's work and it's a necessity as well, but there probably is a little bit more freedom in that as well. So with this, another trend is that men are more apt at investing greater amounts of time in fathering and actually parenting the child. So I see jokes from other friends that have children where, say, like a grandma said, "Oh, that's really good that the man is willing to watch the children." And the joke is, well, yeah, he's very excited to continue being a father. So this is a trend that's changed. And so men are more likely to be investing greater amounts of time, which is a really good thing. It'd be great if this could have changed even earlier than now, but it's good to have some change now too, right? Parental care is often supported by institutional care, so whether that be things like daycares or preschools, and some of this comes from the necessity of working out of the home as well, but this is a trend that there is more supplemental care for families. Uh, in other communities and other cultures, there is more communal raising of a child rather than just it being exclusively the responsibility of parents. And so things look very different in those cultures. So rather than this institutional care where it's a specific daycare, it might be the neighborhood or the neighbors right around you or the whole community at large is really invested in any given child. So that's something that's very different and actually shows a lot of positive benefits in those communities for those children as well. So those are the last points in chapter 12 that I wanted to cover. And we definitely have some time that we can go over the study guide. So before we do that, how about everybody pull up their study guide if you've been working on it? And if you want to go over the study guide with us, we will do that right now. But basically, I'll stop the recording. Anybody who wants to stick around and go over the study guide, we will do that. Anyone who doesn't, that's totally fine too. We'll spend the last, however long we have questions for till the end of class going over that. But again, the exam opens on Friday. I didn't actually pull it up to tell you how many questions are on it. I think there's a few more questions than the last exam. I'm just navigating to it right now. So before anyone leaves, I definitely want to tell you these couple things. It's all multiple choice, same kind of format as it has been in the past. You'll have 80 minutes to take the exam, and it looks like, did I cut it down? No, it's still 60 questions. So 80 minutes, 60 questions, all multiple choice, A, B, C, D answers. So you will have that time limit. Make sure you give yourself time to take the whole exam. And so right now, let's take a quick break. And then when we come back from the break at, let's say 9:23, we will go over the study guide. So anyone who doesn't want to go over the study guide, that's totally fine. Feel free to take off early today and maybe study for the exam with the extra little bit of time you've got. But yeah, good luck on that exam and have a good April. All right, I'll wait a minute for anyone else who's still on break. But definitely, while we're waiting for everybody to come back from break, feel free to put any questions that you have over the study guide just in the meeting chat, and then we can make sure to go over that. So you could just say like, number 7, what does this mean, or something like that. All right. Oh, I was planning on stopping the recording, so here we go.